Hey everyone, it's Sunday, August 11th, 2019, and this is the Product Mentor Talk. Today, we are joined by one of our mentors, Chris Butler, to lead a talk on the alignment of strategy, roadmap, and backlog. I'm going to briefly explain the format, and then we'll move over to introductions of everyone here. So the Product Mentor program was started about 6-7 years ago by Jeremy Horn. It matches product leaders, experienced product veterans with product managers, folks who aspire to be product managers, who get better at product management. It's a mentorship program. It's got 2 sessions every year. Today on Zoom, we're joined by a bunch of our mentors and mentees, as well as on YouTube by listeners around the world. If everyone could wave hi real quick. Let me see that I got that right. There, one more time. Awesome. And we're going to go around the room and do introductions. If everyone could state their name, location, role, and whether they are a mentor or mentee. Let's start with Alex.
Hey guys, I'm Alex. I'm a product manager for a company called LexisNexis in London, and I'm a mentee.
Awesome. Let's move over to Brian.
Hi, I'm Brian Postlenek. I'm a product mentor in this program. I've been product manager for 6 years. I currently work as a product manager at Angie's List, based in Indianapolis, Indiana.
Awesome. Let's move over to Carlos.
So, hello everyone. My name is Carlos. I'm calling from Madrid, Spain. I work for a company called Mr. Yeb, operating mainly in South America, in 14 countries in South America. My mentor is Anissa. I'm a mentee.
Awesome. Let's move over to Chris.
Hey, I'm Chris Butler, and I'm a chief product architect at IPsoft, which is an IT automation company. And I'm usually based out of New York, but I'm in Oakland, California right now, and I'm a mentor. I've been a mentor for quite a number of seasons.
Awesome. Let's move over to Daniel.
Hey, my name is Zander Ponsigny. I'm a mentee based out of Toronto, work at a company called Modo Insight.
Awesome. And John.
I'm John Masterson, and I'm the Chief Product Officer for ImproveWell, a startup in London, and I'm a mentor.
And Marvin.
Hey everyone, my name is Marvin Matthew. I'm the head of product and strategy at a cryptocurrency startup called Bitcoin in New York City, and I'm a mentee.
Nicola.
Hey, I'm Nicola. I'm based in Copenhagen. I work at 2021 AI. I'm a mentee, and my mentor is Yogesh.
Syed.
Hi, everyone. I am based out of New York City. I am joining Verizon as senior product owner. I'm a mentee, and my mentor is Brian.
VVet.
Hi, everyone. This is Vivek from Bangalore. I'm part of the product group in Razorpay, and I'm a mentee.
Yogesh.
Hi, I'm Yogesh, and I'm a senior product manager at Omnicom Health Group, and I'm a mentor here, and I'm located in New York City.
Awesome. And last but not least, Candace.
Hi, I'm Candace Zhang, and I'm based in New Jersey. I'm actually a mentee in this program. So I'm currently head of product management in a company called Tenform.
Awesome. And swinging back to me, I am Nisrom. I'm the mentor lead and the moderator for today's talk, on today's live stream. And now, without further ado, we're going to hand it over to Chris Butler to do his talk. Chris, take it away.
Great, thank you. And so what I'm going to be talking about today is the alignment of strategy, roadmap, and backlog. And maybe just very quickly about me again, chief product architect at IPsoft. I've been part of the product mentorship program for quite a number of seasons, and have about 19 years of product and business development experience. And that includes places like Microsoft, Waze, Kayak. I've worked also at places like Philosophy, which is a design consultancy. And then I even had my own company at a certain point. And this is my email address if you want to get in contact with me after this, and then my Twitter handle. So the alignment of strategy, roadmap, and backlog, what I'm really trying to get at during this presentation is, what are these things? And I'm not going to dive as deep as I usually would into each of these individually, but I think talking about what are some of the really the right ways to deal with them or the right ways to do them, and then how are some of the ways that people go wrong with them, I think is really important. And then I want to talk about alignment, which is something that I think, we talk about as product people a lot of the time, but we don't really practice it as much as I think we should, or focus on it as much as we should. And so, what are these things, right? Really, at a very high level, strategy is to me really the key problem that we're solving, and why us. The roadmap is how do we prioritize these sub problems that we have to solve, and then what is the focus work, from a backlog standpoint? What is the focus work that we're doing right now? And so let's start with strategy. So at a very high level, there's lots of terminology, vision, mission. I would even say in some cases, culture, values, strategy. They all kind of try to point at the same thing, which is what is this really high level aspect of the company that we're trying to get some type of alignment on. I really like John Boyd's definition of this, and John Boyd was a strategist. He's most well known for the OODA loop, which is observe, orient, decide, act, which is like a proto build, measure, learn, or really any other type of decision-making loop you could find out there. And what he really says is that, the real goal of strategy is to survive and survive on our own terms, and to be able to improve our capacity for independent action. And so he makes this definition outside of the definition of a competitor, but he also has a definition which says that if you have a competitor, you're also trying to now limit their ability to take independent action. And so I like this a lot because it points to the fact that, we're not, when we talk about strategy in very particular words, it's not about a particular feature, but it's about how are we enabling ourselves to do these types of features. And I was recently listening to a podcast by the chief people officer at HubSpot, and they were talking a lot about culture. And one of the things that was most interesting to me was they talked about culture being the one thing that they agree on within an organization. And the way I would extend that is I would say that it really sounded an awful lot like they were talking about strategy to me. And I think strategy, when we think about it inside an organization, it's the one thing that we all agree on, that we all, it's basically the immutable truth that we have. It doesn't mean we always have to, it doesn't mean that strategy doesn't change, but just that it's the one thing we all agree on, but that we can disagree about absolutely everything else. And I think this is key when we talk about how, engineers, designers, and product people work together, is that they need to disagree about an awful lot. But if they don't agree on the strategy, there's a lot of problems that start to be caused because of that. And one book that I really like to recommend, and I've recommended this a couple times before, but is Good Strategy, Bad Strategy. And by Richard Rummel, really, really smart person. He's done an awful lot of work around strategy and analysis of strategy by people. So I'm going to dive into this just like a little bit, because I think it's important and interesting to understand. In this way of talking about good strategy and bad strategy, he's really inspired me to look at what are the things that point out badness within a strategy, and actually later on within roadmaps and backlogs. So some of the strategy anti-patterns that come from Rummel's work, as well as some things that I've seen, are the following. So the first one he talks about is really failure to face the challenge. So a strategy that is, has no problem that it's trying to solve and doesn't really go directly at the problem itself is not very valuable, right? Like if you're doing something that is just the solution itself, that's not really a strategy, that's a solution. I think if you mistake goals and planning for strategy, that's another anti-pattern that he's identified. So just saying that you're going to increase your revenue by 30% every year is not a strategy, that's a goal. And the way that strategy goals are different is that strategy is about how are we all aligning around a problem, which is like the earlier anti-pattern. And the problem with focusing on goals is that it may be over-limiting in some ways. The next thing is that it's just a list of things to do. So like if you have a strategy that says we're going to ship these 10 features, again, that's what you're going to get to, is that you're still misidentifying the fact that to exist as an organization, you're there to solve a problem for someone. And it's not just to ship things. I think, the idea of a feature factory is something that is a result of this type of anti-pattern. One that I've found personally is that if you don't actually write your strategy down or you don't talk about it as a strategy to a lot of people, it ends up being everybody's individual strategy, right? Because you're not writing it down, because you're not getting alignment between people, everybody has this idea in their head of what the problem is that they're trying to solve. And usually it gets more localized than kind of generalized within the organization. And that can cause a lot of different types of features or problems being solved rather than just one. I think also not having it written down to be able to use in a bunch of different places, I think is really, really important. And I did write a post called "Your Strategy is Too Sacred," and I think this is related to there's a nuance here, which is that I think that every product manager should have something written down, but there are real problems to getting it written down when everybody believes that strategy is so sacred. And so I think you as a product person should have it written down somewhere. You should have the sentence summary, you should have the paragraph summary, and you should have the long document summary of your strategy. But it doesn't mean necessarily that you're posting it to your internal website. And I want to talk about what does it mean to actually have alignment later on. And then it's about the future rather than the present, right? A strategy is really, if you're not making it some type of thing that you can understand today, you're always going to be putting off doing something towards that strategy if it's in the future. And so while I think a lot of people conflate the idea of strategy as being very future looking, I think, yes, we could say that something like vision or mission is maybe future looking because you want a particular state of the world. But if your strategy isn't something that's helping you make decisions today, it's actually not very valuable. And then I also just love to, throw out some shade on SWOT, but I think SWOT is like a horrible tool. And the reason why I think SWOT is a horrible tool, and if people are not familiar with this, SWOT is really about strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and I always blank on the last one because I never use it. But basically the strengths and weaknesses about your organization, it's really hard for you to be very unbiased about what those strengths and weaknesses are. And the truth is that when you do this type of thinking, you're kind of probably getting in alignment with everybody about some biased viewpoint of your actual system. And then finally, the one that Romolt brings up that I really think is hilarious is fluff. So almost every not every strategy, but I've seen a lot of strategies where they say that they're going to be like best in class or world leading or something like that. And one of the things that he talks about to see whether something is fluff is to just take the opposite of something. And so, does it ever really make sense to not be the world class type of provider in something? Or does it make sense to really not have best in class customer service? And I always like to make a joke that maybe Spirit Air or something like that banks on that model, but I think it's very rare that being the best at something is not what you want to do as a strategy. So what is a good strategy, right? And I think I've done. This is actually not just this is not a product mentor talk within a product mentor talk, but I did a talk back in season 6 about basically strategy for agile environments. And so I would reference that. But when we talk about good strategy, Richard Romolt has talked about it where you need to break it into really 3 key components. And the first component is really some type of diagnosis. And this diagnosis is an explanation of the nature of the challenge. And so when I say challenge, I mean, what is the thing you're solving for someone out there? And part of that is why is this why is this problem important to solve? Who has it maybe? And then an explanation of it, essentially. The next level down is really, why are we special to solve it, right? The guiding policy is an approach to solve this using whatever our resources or benefits or moats or whatever we want to talk about it. What is special about us solving this particular thing, or what is the policy for that? And then linking that directly to coherent actions, which is like steps we're taking within our organizations. And that could be building things, but it could also be the way we set up our organizations. And so strategy kernel, I think, is a really, really effective tool or kind of framework to understand what is a good strategy. And so really briefly, as an example, right? This is a bit of a toy example, but the idea of a doctor's kernel, right? So like a doctor, there are a set of kind of signs, symptoms together with a history, and there's some type of, diagnosis that it needs to make. So it's like, it's this type of disease or it's this type of pathology, right? Once you have that challenge that you're now trying to solve as a doctor, you need to decide a therapeutic approach. And so there's different schools of thought within medicine about how to do things. And then finally, you take action in some way. So that could be prescriptions, it could be diet, it could be particular therapies. And so in the end, the doctor is really linking all of these things from a very high level challenge, which is that set of that diagnosis essentially, all the way down to the particular things that the patient needs to do. And so maybe taking a bigger example, this is one that's referenced in the book, which I like to use. And Nvidia is a graphics chip manufacturer. When Rummel wrote this book, he was really looking at the fact that during the 90s, there was a change from kind of use of 3D cards for multimedia, which was usually because, back then we didn't have computers that really did graphics very well, to a case where people were doing a lot of 3D gaming. And so Nvidia, they were trying to make this change to 3D gaming, but they had, 3DFX was a competitor that had owned the market for a little while for that type of segment. And then they saw Intel was going to start getting to it. So they were trying to consider what could they do to actually improve their chances within the market through a strategic means. And so what they did, and there's a lot of text, but I'll walk you through it. I mean, basically, the real diagnosis was that because there's an emerging 3D gaming market, the more that those gamers always wanted more power, right? They wanted more ability to do higher and higher end graphics, and the game manufacturers were depending on that. So whatever they could build, there was a market out there that would buy it, right? And if they basically with these other competitors, if they were able to provide these cards, Nvidia would not be able to gain the market share that it had because there's always like another buying opportunity, essentially. And so their guiding policy was really to break out of this 18-month development cycle. And where this comes from is the 18-month cycle was because of Moore's law, right? Is that just for whatever reason, all the different card manufacturers had settled on the fact that every 18 months they were coming out with a different card. And what they decided to do from an NVIDIA standpoint was to break out each of the teams into a different 6-month cycle. And what that meant was that they'd be releasing cards every 6 months that if someone wanted to buy a new card because they needed more power for a game that had come out, NVIDIA would have usually the fastest, most kind of current card available in the market. And the way that they then did this was through a bunch of different coherent actions. And that included 3 development teams working in parallel. They started to pull kind of drivers and away from all of the different hardware manufacturers so that they could own that. They had to create actually an abstraction layer between the drivers that the chip manufacturers would make and what they would have. They then started to outsource fabrication, and then finally they sold to computer makers rather than board makers. And so all of these things together really meant that in the end, NVIDIA became the quintessential seller of these cards, and and Intel ended up losing, didn't end up really gaining much market when they tried to enter into the 3D graphics market. And so, of course, this is an example from a long time ago, and people that are now joining the workforce may not even, they may know NVIDIA, but probably more as NVIDIA as a like AI and machine learning card use or a Bitcoin mining use. I'm sure people still buy NVIDIA cards for gaming, but it's one of those things where all of this happened like a long time ago, right? So what I try to do, and again, this is what my assumption about Airbnb's kernel would be. So I'm kind of doing a post hoc analysis of this. They probably didn't use a kernel tool to do this, but I just want to make sure that it's clear that, how would we break up what Airbnb does, right? So my diagnosis is that there's a lack of liquidity in the short-term stay market that keeps travelers staying at high-price hotels, right? So because of this issue that, hotels have been around for a very long time. People have owned places or rented places for a very long time that has extra rooms. And so there's a lot of waste when it comes to vacancy of just an actual room within any area. And so what they thought was that building a marketplace that then takes advantage of this, this inefficiency to be able to connect guests with these hosts that are willing to give their, rent their rooms out. That was really their policy. And they believed that they could get over any of what, they were not held back by the idea of trust or safety concerns in those cases. But some of the coherent actions that they would then take is, a very simple booking experience to make it more like hotels. Being able to have a guest and a host provide feedback on each other to keep the marketplace fair, and then removing bad actors. And then one I just like to throw in for this as well is that they basically ignored local tourism taxes and policies as a coherent action, right? Like they did not work with cities up front. They did not ask for permission. They just did things, and then eventually they have to work with them. And so that's kind of my analysis of how we break this out. So I think the kernel is really like a really effective way to talk about what is good strategy. And the next thing I would say is that strategies are really mental models, right? So when we think about a mental model within your organization, or what a mental model is, Charlie Munger talks about this a lot, right? So if the facts, don't hang together on a latticework of theory, you don't have them in a usable form. And a mental model is how do you view the world, and then how do you make decisions on it based on some, basically heuristic to be able to do that. And so I think, one of the things we don't consider a lot of the time is that, especially as part of an alignment step between all of the different functions, is that if people don't in some way really get at a deep level what your mental what your strategy is, they will not be taking actions when they're not around you as a product person based on that strategy. And so mental models are a way to kind of load that into your head. And it's something that I think, Charlie Munger has talked about an awful lot. And also Farnham Street is another great blog that talks about mental models in general. And what's interesting about this is that you can also start to compress these mental models into almost sayings. And so there's a great article by an ex-strategist from Amazon, and he would talk about JPEGing your strategy, I think is what the title was called. And what Jeff Bezos would do is that every year or two, he would create a new kind of saying. And there would be a huge unveiling of the strategy or the problem we're trying to solve as Amazon. And that strategy would have something like a half-hour to hour-long presentation of evidence, a lot of information about what is the problem, how we actually, and they would not put it in these terms necessarily, but like how are we meant to solve this? And then what are maybe some of the coherent actions we're actually going to do? And then what they would have is they would really have a saying that would tie all this together so that whenever they're having a conversation internal to the organization, they could just do this. And so getting our house in order was really about like fixing all of the systems we had. Another one was that they use, actually still a lot of the time, is that it's day one, right? Like this is the first release of the product, now go out and fix it. And so they use this method an awful lot, right? Like how do you make it so that your strategy can be referenceable just by a saying, or, in the case of Melinda Gates, in the Melinda Gates Foundation, they basically will compress it down to one word. And so while you may get a lot of variability under what the word gentle would mean to you, there's still all of this discussion you've had around what is gentle within this organization. And so I think that's really powerful. And I would definitely say that's important when we talk about this type of stuff. So that's everything I wanted to talk about as far as strategy. I mean, we have a lot of ground to cover with roadmaps and backlogs. So I'm not going to dive too much deeper into this, but I wanted to give kind of like an overview of where I believe strategy should be and some of the anti-patterns I've seen for strategy.
Hey, Chris, before you get into that, we've got a question, which is really great. You just mentioned, let me stop your sharing here. You mentioned that Amazon does this every year and a half. We've got a question from VVet. Let me just spotlight him so he can ask his question.
Hey, Chris. So we talk about strategy, right? How far in future you should think about when you're thinking about strategy? Because ultimately the company's vision remains same. What changes the strategy, as you mentioned, right? So what is a good time?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the problems that I see a lot of the time with the way that strategy is built, is that it's about some future state rather than you're solving problems today. So, I think it's fine if you want to talk about the idea of vision being, here's the end state of the world as we see it in 5 or 10 years, right? And I appreciate the fact that as a product manager, one of our key mental models is looking for an end state and then working backwards, right? But what I would say is that the strategy is actually not meant to tell you what that future thing is. What it's meant to tell you is what is the actual problem we're trying to solve today. And so it's supposed to be timeless to me. Like that's, I think, a really, really important aspect. Now, it doesn't mean that you shouldn't plan like 5 years out. Like if there's an end vision state that you have that's 5 years out, how do you plan for that is a different activity, right? Like that's where you then start to break up these, like, what do I have to do before I do this, right? What do I have to do before this? And those are components that then you start to see you have to build. But I would also argue that, like, do you even know that the problem you're trying to solve is worth solving based on the way you want to solve it? And so that to me is where you're trying to shorten your cycles of decision making to be able to go and basically have decision, so prototyping, the idea of user research, these are all things that are trying to shorten decision cycles for us rather than having to depend on kind of releasing to the market, right? Which is that's the right way to do it, right? Because that's the end goal, is you want to sell something to a customer or to a client or something like that. But you can learn about things and you can reduce your risk and uncertainty way earlier before that. So that's all I'd say. I just want to reiterate that, like, again, strategy is really meant to be a decision-making framework for you right now. It's supposed to help you make a decision between two hard choices. If a decision is ever like, if you ever have a strategy, again, this gets back to fluff, right? Like the strategy is not like we're going to be the worst company ever or the best company ever, right? Like that's kind of a no-brainer. Like at least I would say that it's maybe no-brainer is not fair, but it's like, it's very rare that you ever have that type of like black and white, good and bad type of thing. It's always about gray areas. So it should be more about like, what are these really hard decisions we need to make? And how do we build a strategy to let those people do a better job of making those decisions?
Mm-hmm. Got it.
Awesome. We have another question from Alex. You're muted, Alex. Sorry.
Cool. Cheers. My question is around, do you ever externalize your strategy? So I guess with your vision and your roadmap, that's more customer facing and kind of helps get them on board with where you're trying to get to. Would you do that as well with your strategy, or is that more internal?
I think if it's helpful, right? Like, again, not a lot of people actually expose their full vision. I mean, some people like Elon Musk is famous for basically exposing his grand vision around a lot of things. And so I would say it depends on your industry. And I would say it depends on what your customers need to make decisions, right? So the reason why people externalize roadmaps a lot of the time is because they want to be able to sell to customers that need something that they don't have yet, right? And so it's like a proof point that, hey, I'm actually thinking about this. And we'll get it to eventually. I want to talk about timeframes and roadmaps, so we'll get to that in a second. But vision is another interesting one. I think if it helps your customer make a decision to buy with you, then that is an appropriate time to externalize your vision. Yeah.
Cool. Take it away, Chris.
All right. So now that we're done with strategy, let's talk about roadmaps. So I made this. I thought it was funny. I don't know if anybody else thinks it's funny, but this is going to be, I think, one of the only memes in this actual presentation. I try to limit myself to one at a time. But I think a lot of people think of roadmaps in a very particular way, and I think that they're probably wrong, personally. So what are the basics, right? It's usually just a list of bigger things to address. So we'll talk about the smaller things to address, which is the backlog. It's ordered by priority to be addressed. And it's actually shared within the team in some way. Usually it's to get alignment between these teams. And then when we talk about the future, so like the roadmap is meant to be this kind of like time frame to the future. And so as we move out further and further into the future, means that things get less and less certain. And so let's talk about what good road mapping is. So I believe in a very particular camp of road mapping, and I'll talk about what that means. And so take this as you will, but I think this is like a very valuable way to do good road mapping. And this comes from a post by Jared Spool about themes and thematic road mapping. Basically, themes and thematic road mapping is a way to, if we now start with the assumption that our strategy is solving a key challenge, what are the challenges below that challenge, or that make up that challenge, or interact with that challenge that we should solve in some piecemeal way to understand whether we can solve the bigger challenge? And so themes are really meant to be that thing where rather than say epics or something like that, it's not exactly what he means, and I'll talk about some anti-patterns in a second. But it's really about like, what are these big pieces of the problem that we want to solve in some priority order? And so I believe this is actually a really great way to do it rather than feature oriented. And so I've also written a post about this, being very specific. And I've done a talk about it as well, if you're interested. Actually, that's a horrible time to take a screenshot of me, but I did for some reason. And then, so let's use this as an example of pointing out a lot of the things that I think are good about a roadmap. And so this is an example I put together for thematic roadmaps. And so you can see here that I've really broken into 4 buckets. And the last bucket I actually only have when we're doing planning. So it's really about, what are we doing now? What are we doing next? And what are we doing later? And so in the thematic kind of discussion, most of it has really just been around like, how are we forming these things as problems in some type of stack ranking? But what I guess I've realized is that over time, we tend to operate on multiple themes at the same time, especially when we have a team that is a bit larger. And then also, we know what is maybe ready to work on versus what we want to do but is not ready to work on. And that's why I've added these timeframes. And then what I also like to say is that there's an interesting kind of confidence and likelihood about which of these things are actually going to happen. Or maybe if you want to put it another way, like which of these things are certain versus uncertain, more certain versus less certain. And so The now is something that we're working on right now. Like we're pretty sure it's going to happen. Like unless we find some major snafu in the way that we're going to implement this, we will actually do this project, right? Next is things that we prepared or we've been preparing for or understand better. We've done a lot of research on. We know that this is a high priority and we should take care of it next. And then later is really things that we know we want to do after these things, but that we haven't really done enough work yet, or it hasn't come up to be a priority enough. And then the to be considered I use as a column, which is usually empty, other than when we want to basically create some time to realign the roadmap. A lot of the time we'll have a meeting around this and we'll then have a list of other problems we should consider. And so I'll put those in the to be considered pile. And the reason why is that it's really about how do we now interact with management to allow for placing these things. So that's kind of an overall overview of how I think about road mapping and what is good road mapping. And then, of course, what I want to get into now is really like, what are some of the problems that people have with road mapping a lot of the time? This will be illustrative of what I think is a good roadmap. And so this is a Bruce McCarthy post who's done a lot of talking about road mapping. He was the original person that came up with thematic road mapping that Jared Spool then referenced. But he has a great dirty dozen of kind of roadmap roadblocks, and then I've added a bunch that I've seen as well. So the first one is conflating strategy, mission, or vision with roadmaps, right? A roadmap is really that list of problems we're going to solve, almost not exactly a list of things to do, but it's very close to that, right? And so a roadmap is not a strategy. If someone asks for your strategy and you give them a roadmap, you're basically just telling them what features are you going to ship. Not exactly, but that's kind of where we're getting at, right? If you're not linking the strategy to the roadmap, that is also very problematic. And I think this gets to the point around alignment, right? Is that if you have a strategy that you're working on and you say that this is the mental model that you're going to use to solve problems, but the roadmap is based on a completely different set of things to work on. When the person has that mental model to make a decision, they're going to make decisions that don't make sense between those two things. If it's all about features, I know I mentioned that really briefly earlier, but I think if it's about features, you're missing the point of the roadmap. Now, there's some nuance around this particular anti-pattern, right? Like in some cases, I have had to create feature-based roadmaps for, I guess like sales and marketing types of activities. But I think, and I think Intercom has talked about this a little bit, that part of that just points at a dysfunction between in the relationship between product and marketing and sales. In that, something that I do at IPsoft is that a lot of the salespeople want to sell the features of this conversational agent that we built, right? But the thing that I'm trying to, I constantly am a broken record about is that here's the types of problems that conversational agents in general will solve, and in particular, our type of conversational agent will solve. So I guess what I've learned over time is that it shouldn't be about features. Your roadmap should not be about features. But if you're constantly being asked, well, hey, I just need to know what to sell, or I need to know what to market, that really points at a dysfunction that you're not bringing them on board with the being problem oriented. And in the end, consumers really care about their problems and about how you're going to change them from one state to another, rather than what your particular solution is, even if they say that that's the case. The next thing is inside out thinking. So really being focused on a roadmap that is based on what you want rather than what your customers want, right? You should be always focusing on what it is, what's the hottest topic or the biggest need that your customers have, and how do you give that to them, rather than what you believe is really the problem. And I think this is a little bit related to the fact that sometimes technical debt will show up on roadmaps or even backlogs as just itself, right? You should never, in my opinion, and I realize this might be controversial, you should never address technical debt unless there's a user benefit, right? And if anything, if technical debt can sit there for a while and it just seems to work, I would even argue maybe that code is not necessary. You should get rid of that feature. Anyways, I have a lot of, obscure and extreme feelings about these types of things, but inside out is a really important one, I think, for road mapping. If you're not building things for your customer, you're not prioritizing for your customer through your roadmap, you're going to see dysfunction further down the line in your backlog. The roadmap should also not be a backlog, right? It should not be an icebox of ideas. Someone was asking me about, I was in a planning meeting and they were like, well, so where are we going to put this work item that doesn't have anything to do with what we're doing right now? And so I then basically wrote backlog and icebox on a trash can. And to illustrate a point, I thought it was very funny. But in the end, like the roadmap is not where you collect things, right? It's not meant to be this huge list. It's not meant to be the backlog that you then provide to the to-do list. That's not what it's meant to be. And if you do that at that level, if you are just collecting other people's ideas, you're just going to have a huge list of things that don't matter, basically. And then it should not be carefully set by the product person alone, right? The roadmap is actually the combination of everybody working together, just like the backlog is. And so I tend to have an opinion. This may be from the fact that I'm more from the balanced team roots, but it's that, you know, you should involve your management, you should involve engineering management, you should involve everybody that is thinking about the higher level goals of the organization in the discussion of the roadmap, basically. And if you don't, you're going to try to present something to be like, ta-da, and people are like, well, what about this? And I don't like that, and I don't think this makes sense, basically. So that's it for road mapping. And I'll pause for a second here before we jump into backlogs and alignment. But I think these are kind of some things that I've seen when people try to build roadmaps, and they definitely suffer from.
Hey, Chris, we've got a question from Marvin. Give me 1 second here.
Great.
Marvin, I'll give you the spotlight.
All right. Thanks. Hey, Chris. One thing I was curious about, and something I've been having a challenge with in my organization, is getting stakeholders together on a roadmap in a really productive and effective way. So I was wondering if you had any tips or frameworks for doing that.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things that I would do, so we'll talk about tempo of these things in a little bit. But one project in particular where I think it worked really well was that I would actually this was in particular was about a 3-week project. So I think you could expand this out to kind of mean the tempo overall. But you know, we were doing weekly sprints, and we had basically, after a bunch of user research up ahead, and I realize that's a little bit of a gated development thing, but I also argue that maybe agile and gated development are really just different timeframes. So what we did though is we did a bunch of research, and then part of the output from the research sprints that we had done was actually a thematic roadmap. And so part of that thematic roadmap, the beginning of it at least, the way it was built was that I went through and I looked at all of the research synthesis that design had been doing. And I was also doing a lot of the research, so I was very familiar with it. But then I created a list of the problems that I think we needed to solve. And that was after also we did a strategic workshop where I have like every product person wants to become senior enough has to build a canvas. So I built a strategy canvas. And so I use this like methodology to build out the kernel for them. So I had the strategic kernel to the best of the understanding of the organization at that point, which is a brand new organization. I had all this research synthesized. I created a roadmap, or what I did before creating a roadmap was I created all of the problems that I thought were appropriate for the next kind of, whatever I thought would be like the next couple months, basically, of problems we should solve that fit underneath the strategic understanding of the organization, right? And then rather than putting them in now, next, and later, I actually put them in a huge list off to the side. I had those 3 columns right there. And I basically said, okay, here's all the research that we did. Here's kind of the high level outcomes from that research. We also sent it out to them. So there's more of a recap. And then what we said is I said, okay, well, here's all the problems that I put together that I think are really important for us to solve. Let's review all these, right? So we went through and reviewed all of them. I put them in loose priority order. Like I didn't tell them that, but I put them in loose priority order. And then essentially what we did was I said, okay, well, so now we know what's in this backlog, or sorry, not backlog, in this roadmap, possible roadmap. Like, where do we want to put these? What's the first thing we should work on, right? What's most important? Like if we think about the strategy and we think about what we want to get done in the next 3 months, what's the most important thing? And this is where prioritization comes in, which is very interesting, right? And so there's a lot of different ways to prioritize. In our case, it was a mixture between what do we need to build to get to an MVP, and then what is also the most unknown thing that we have right now. And so we tried to balance those two within basically the prioritization. And then with everybody, I would say, okay, well, so where do we think this should go? And then everybody would kind of have a discussion. We'd place it on the backlog. And in some cases, we'd actually remove, the roadmap. In some cases, we'd remove it from the roadmap altogether if it didn't make sense. And so we did that for each of those items. And so it was really a group activity, right? It was no longer me coming up with a roadmap and then presenting it and then people shooting a bunch of holes in it. It was like if people disagreed, we had to disagree in that meeting and have a discussion about it and then place it in the roadmap. And then what we did as a way of maintenance after that was every like 4 sprints or so, like I would be moving things through the basically I'd be pulling things from later, to next to now, as we were building out different sprints. And so the list of things in later started getting less and less. And so at about every month or so, in this case, we would look at I would then bring up another list of problems that we had discovered. We'd realign around the now, next, and later. And then we would rearrange them if we need to, remove them, replace them, change them, split them. I mean, all the stuff you do with like user story splitting as well comes to play here. So anyways, that's what we tried to do. It was just that I would usually do all the prep work for the roadmap, but then we would do the roadmap together. Is maybe the way to think about it. All right.
Great. Thanks, Chris. We've got actually one more question, but I want to keep moving here for the sake of time. So take it away.
All right. Thank you. All right. Great. So backlog. So what is this? It's basically the to-do list, right? I mean, that's really what it is. And what are the basics? It's a list of things to do. Each item is in some type of format appropriate for a team. So that could be a user story, a job story, whatever. It's ordered in priority to be done. So usually you're not pulling from like a mass of things, you're pulling from a list of things. And then it meets some definition of ready. And I realize that some people have either an unwritten definition of ready, or you're like a Scrum person and have a very specific definition of ready. But there's some like leveling here that says essentially, we're ready to now start working on this based on the standards of our community, right? But I also wanted to collect a list of controversial aspects. And I put controversial in quotes because I think they're more controversial for me than for the industry. And so I wanted to talk about them very briefly. So including estimates or points. So the idea of doing something brand new, right? And actually, I was just at Agile Alliance, the conference last week down in DC, and talked to a lot of people about the idea of estimation or using like different types of forecasting rather than estimation techniques. And so I think there's a lot to be done here. I think that the current way we do estimation is entirely too optimistic. And so I just would say that I think sometimes backlogs will include estimates. In some cases, groups that I would work on, we would already have acceptance criteria built in when we would in the backlog. And so I think this is both good and bad. Sometimes acceptance criteria is good to have before you actually know what you're doing because it helps reframe or frame in some way. But I think it also could be bad because you're over kind of setting what should be done within this work item for the team to take care of. I also think that maybe generating this list before the planning meeting, I think can be bad in some way. And same thing with the drawn from another huge list somewhere else. The biggest issue I see is that, especially for people that are truly trying to be agile, if you build a huge list somewhere else of things to do, it's your past self telling your current self what to do. And from the agile mindset standpoint, is that's really bad. And the reason why that's bad is because your past self doesn't have as much knowledge as your current self does. And so I think this is why I feel the way I do about things like ice boxes as well. It's just, if something is really important, it will come up again. And so I don't understand why we build these humongous lists of things for us to do when the reality is we know what we need to do right now. And then finally, I think one of the things that some people do is they'll just put dev tasks in the backlog. And I think that's also problematic, right? Like you should be including work that the entire team is doing. And if your team includes product people and designers, you should include that. And even if it includes data scientists, you should include that, right? You want visibility between the team of what's actually going on. And here's a few other additional anti-patterns. So those are all kind of, I think, things that, you could make an argument for one way or the other, depending on the team. But here's some real like anti-patterns I've found. And so, yes, having a humongous list of things to do is really, really bad, right? You should not have something that takes the product person hours and hours and hours to review and to groom on a regular basis. That's an anti-pattern. It's generated way in advance. I already talked about this. I want to just reiterate, I think this is bad, but I know that some people do this. And I think there's a real differentiation between what is the official backlog versus what is some type of idea set that people can control on their own. So I think it's absolutely fine for an engineer to write down a list of the things that they need to do to actually create some type of technology. But if it's not something that's being worked on in the near term or even like in the next couple sprints, I don't see why it should be in the backlog at all, personally. The next one is that it's full of ideas, not qualified work. I already talked about this, but it's basically ideas are not something to work on. And then also, I think, my last talk was about user research for the product mentor. And I think one of the things I've seen is that people will just take like all the findings from their research and they'll just drop it into the backlog and then they assume that turns into work items. And I think that's incorrect, right? It's you as a product person that should be the filter between all of your research findings and then the synthesis of those research findings into what is actually taking action, what's taking action within the group. And so I think it's an anti-pattern to just outright include your research in your backlog at this point. And I think the reason why that ends up being bad is that just because a customer asks for something in a particular way doesn't mean that's the way you're going to solve it. And that's where I think product managers really come in from a prioritization process standpoint. And then, if it's never changed, it's not really a backlog, right? Like if you're locking yourself into a set of things, that is bad because you're not using your most current information and you're not using that to now decide what to work on. So that's it for backlog. I think I want to just talk really, let's talk now about like what does it mean to do alignment, right? And when I talk about alignment, I think about that there's these three levels that we just talked about: strategy, roadmap, and backlog. There's something key about them being aligned, right? If we go back to what Richard Rummel was talking about, is that he really meant that we have to link from this top level challenge to the coherent actions that we do, and the guiding policy is part of that. But I think you can, when we talk about it in the parlance of product management, what we're really saying is that strategy, roadmap, and backlog need to be in line. And what I mean, again, strategy is timeless and forever. We have our roadmap, which is the foreseeable future. And I guess what I'd say when I use the word foreseeable, I mean one that is more certain than not. And then finally, what we're actually doing this sprint or this block of work, like how are we focusing on this big problem, right? And so, I think there's a few anti-patterns I've seen when it comes to aligning these three things. And so one of them is really mistaking status emails as alignment, right? And so I think, just because you go and send out a bunch of information, it doesn't mean that you're actually building alignment within the team. And this is actually really the only anti-pattern I've seen around alignment. I think, there's probably a lot of bad ways to do alignment, like just, again, assuming status is alignment. But in the end, like, you should be asking it and again, I want to talk about what the tempo is and things like that. But in the end, like, I think alignment from the standpoint of how are you making sure all of your pieces of your organization are working together towards the same goal is highly valuable. And in the end, doesn't actually cause many problems, right? So let's talk about realignment and tempo around this, because I think that's what we're really trying to get to. And I'll try to save some time for some questions. But this is a really great post by Brandon Chu. It was from a while ago. But his first rule is really to be the broken record around strategy. And so what we mean by this is that you should have in your head, even if your strategy is not published somewhere, you should have in your head the 1 or 2 sentence overview of that challenge and reason why we're here to solve it. Because when you're having a discussion, you should be referencing it all the time. You should, anytime that someone comes up to you and asks you for some help on a decision, for example, you should frame it by like, okay, well, so if what we're really trying to do is we're trying to solve X by way of Y, what does that mean for this decision, right? You should be framing things like that almost every single time that you bring that up. And that's why it's important for you to really internalize the strategy. The next thing is that you should make it a part of every planning and review meeting. And so what I mean by that is that, planning meetings are really meant to be that time, in my opinion, where you generate your work items for the sprint. And that's because you're freshest around the knowledge that you need to be able to take action. And during that planning meeting, it's really about the idea of how do you now, based on the, reiterating the strategy, okay, so we're all here to solve X through Y. Here are the next couple roadmap items that we've decided to work on now. Making sure everybody agrees to that still. And then finally, the backlog should then, if you generate it from that perspective, it will be as aligned as possible with that. And so what I mean by that is that one of the things I'll do during planning meetings is I'll actually have people basically, we'll take 5 minutes and we'll say, based on, here's the overview of what we're trying to solve, which is the strategy. Here's the 3 themes that we're still going after, the 3 kind of sub-problems we're going after. I want everybody to now privately ideate, which means silently and on their own. I want them to create all of the work items. And sometimes I'll just put this directly in Trello. Sometimes we'll do it on Post-it notes. It depends on the team. I want you to create all of the work items that we need to do to solve this. And so we create all those work items. And then if you have work items that are from a previous sprint, for example, that's the moment that we then do reprioritization. And we do that in the meeting together. And basically what you leave this planning meeting with is you leave this planning meeting with a list of the things to do for that next sprint. In our case, it was a week. But it could be 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks. It depends on how you're running your team, where basically you now have the most alignment as possible with your strategy, roadmap, and backlog that you have working on right now for that deep work. And then what you do when going into the review meeting, you're actually using that review meeting as a place to now say, again, here's what we're trying to solve. We're trying to solve X through Y. And here's the 3 sub problems we felt we were going to try to solve this week. How did we do? Right? Did we build something? And then now when we look at it, we're like, actually, this doesn't solve the problem the way we thought. Or did we learn something that then invalidates maybe the 3 things that we should be working on? And then in maybe the craziest case is like, does this invalidate something that the strategy needs to take into account? And that should be incredibly rare, but it does happen. So I think that's a great way to look through this like planning and review meeting. And then whenever you detect drift, this is a great time to have these conversations, right? Just in general, to reiterate the strategy, to reiterate the roadmap, and maybe even looking at the backlog randomly. But it's like the main way that I've found to really detect drift is that every now and then, and I mean that like maybe every sprint or 2, I believe heavily in the idea of like one-on-ones between the product person and almost every teammate. It doesn't have to be official, like it doesn't have to be on the calendar, but you should be seeking out time to kind of just say like, how are things going? And then I think the really key question is, do you know how your work connects to the strategy? And I think this is really, really interesting. You should not prompt them again with the strategy in this case, but I think what you'll start to find is you'll start to see, people will give, if they start to give you a myriad of answers in how the strategy actually works, or if they don't know how their current work actually connects to the strategy, that means that there's a problem potentially. And this is not a quantitative way to do this. I think there are potential quantitative ways using things like the language that people use, things like that. But I found the simplest way to do this possible is really around just, asking someone, do you know how this connects to the strategy? And then listen to their answer, and then use that as the ability to learn more. And so that's really realignment, right? Realignment is one of these things you should be doing all the time. I think there's different types of realignment at different levels of the product. So in closing, right? Strategy is really that one thing that we agree on. The roadmap is really that prioritization of the problems that make up that one thing we agree on. The backlog should always be the latest thinking. And use this maybe as a guide to watch out for these anti-patterns. And then finally, I've found I haven't been able to find an argument against actually aligning your strategy, roadmap, and backlog, and you should be doing it all the time. So thank you. If you want this slide deck, you'll find it here on this link. And thank you.
Thanks, Chris. We've got several questions here.
Great.
First, Syed, I will hand the spotlight over to you.
Hi, Chris. So I listed 3 questions, but I have 4 questions now. So the first question is, what's the advantage of a thematic roadmap over a feature-based roadmap?
Yeah, I think we get back to that fact that a feature-based roadmap is saying that you have a lot of certainty in the future when you really don't, right? Like that you're not going to learn something sometime between now and when you're going to execute that feature that is not going to change your mind. And so I think the problem there is that even though we will all say that the uncertainty is very high for these very future features, everybody else that looks at that roadmap sees it as a commitment. And that's really, really problematic, especially when we should be constantly learning from what we're doing. Now, maybe there's times when this is something you've built out a million times before. Maybe that's when you can actually say, like, I'm going to ship exactly this. And that, from my point of view, like if you're building something that's multiple years, there's always going to be unknown things. Even when we talk about like buildings, when we talk about like bridges, right? Like we start to get to this like huge scale type of stuff. There's always like work that has to happen that's unknown. And so I would just say that's the issue, is that it's your past self telling your future self what to do, even though it may not know the most information right now.
Thank you. So my second question is, so let's say you developed the thematic roadmap, and then you come back and you find there are more problems to be solved. So how do you adjust the roadmap? Because it's theme-based.
Yeah, that's right. So if there are more problems to be solved, that essentially what you're doing is you're preparing a list of the problems that you think need to be added. maybe even marking things that you think need to be changed. And then you have that discussion with your team again that says basically, I think based on what we learned, it looks like these themes are no longer appropriate, right? Or what we learned about this theme, actually it's 3 themes and we should break them out. And so it's essentially, you're trying to keep this small set of things that you're working on, and you're throwing away everything else that doesn't matter. Like I'm extreme when it comes to archiving issues. Like, I just don't care. If it doesn't have anything to do with what we're doing right now, I do not want it in this thing that is our mindset right now. So that's how I do that, is that you should be doing that like every, couple month or 2, like maybe quarter if it's big, but like you should be realigning these things all the time.
So essentially it's kind of redeveloping the roadmap.
Yeah, that's right. Your roadmap is not static. If it's static, it's not good then, I think. Yeah, that's an anti-pattern.
Thank you. 2 more questions. So, one of the things you mentioned, and I'm going to read off because I've listed the question here, that, not every item or thought should be in the backlog. So if you gain some knowledge or feedback from your stakeholders or customers, and you don't want to store it in as part of the backlog, do you store it in Confluence? And if you do, then how do you create transparency amongst your team members and your stakeholders?
I mean, I think the truth is that Confluence is kind of the dumping ground for information anyways. So I would say, sure, put it there. But what I would do is I would probably utilize individual people's spaces. Like if people want to keep an idea log, like a journal of ideas that they have, I think that's perfectly acceptable. It's just that they should be using that when we get into the planning meeting to generate work, or in the roadmap meeting to talk about what are the problems we're trying to solve. It should not be that it's not the product person's job to manage everybody else's ideas. That's just like my statement there. So if someone tries to put an idea into my backlog or roadmap, I'm just like, that's interesting, but we're not working on it right now. So if you want to store it somewhere, and frankly, it's up to you to decide how you want to store it. Let's bring it up when it's appropriate, right? But right now, it's all it's going to do is it's going to create overhead for the entire team. And one more question.
You're muted. Say it.
Sorry. Can I? Okay. So the last question in your last slide, you were referring to the backlog as latest thinking. I didn't fully understand that concept.
Yeah.
Do you mind elaborating?
Yeah, absolutely. So what I mean by the backlog being the latest thinking is it's like the things that we really think are most important to do right now, right? Like it's everything that should be in the backlog right now, like that list of to do. It should be based on everything that at that moment. In the entire team. And I guess it's just, I'm kind of trying to tie the fact that it's not only just, it's based on the most current research, it's based on your most current decisions, and it's based on the fact that this is what you need to be doing right this moment. And so from my perspective, that's like the latest thinking within the team. And that's kind of the short answer to that.
Yeah, thank you.
We've also got a question from Yogesh.
Hey.
You're muted, Yogesh. Yep.
Hi, Chris. Thank you for talking about this road mapping.
Yeah.
So I would like to talk about the fact that you were talking about the unknown things in the roadmap. And one of my findings over the years is that unknown things are generally, we have very little idea or have zero knowledge about it when we just doing a road mapping. So how do you keep how do you put them in the roadmap, basically, because we have zero idea about the amount of effort required, what are the different unknowns, and what is the relevance on that? So how do you take care of those things?
Yeah, so I mean, it depends on the team and the stage of the team, but if a team is just getting started, usually that roadmap is actually questions that they have just about their customers, right? So I would say it's not so much about problems in that case, but it's basically just a list of questions, right? And so I've definitely coached people where they're just getting started, and so it just lists your questions and lists your assumptions about them, and then go off and do the research, right? And that's really at that stage. For things where it's a later stage company, they have a lot of other things they're working on, it basically becomes somewhere between like a research sprint and a spiking sprint, right? Because usually there's both technical and understanding things about that customer that you need to do. Like, what are the ways that other people solve this? How could we solve this technically within our organization? But also, like, what are these people actually are considering as a solution? What is the real problem that they understand, right? So I think of those things like the theme can still just be a regular problem like everything else in that list. It's just that it's something you actually have zero knowledge about. I would still put down what your assumptions are because you always want to be checking and calibrating yourself. But that's really what it is.
Cool. We've got the last question now from John. If we could do this somewhat accelerated, would be appreciated.
Okay, I'll ask really quick. And apologies in advance, Chris. I'm going to put you on the spot here. One of the things I've noticed in doing the mentoring is that I sort of I project this image of how things should be, and it's probably not always the case in my. So just as out of interest in your current backlog and your current roadmap, like how many items are in there? You don't know. I'm testing you basically.
No, and you know what? Here's the thing: is that the organization that I'm in right now, my role is not to manage the backlog, and so it is not the way that I would want it to be. Let's just put it that way. But in my previous role, like I'd say the design consultancy was the time where we were probably near the last year of projects where we had the highest alignment with this type of strategy. Now, what's most important though is you should also be retroing every sprint, right? And so having these exact setup the way that I like to have it, it doesn't always turn out exactly that way, and that's because the team doesn't need it that way, right? So that's what I would say. I'm fairly new into my org as well, so I'm only 6 months in, and maybe this goes back to another rule I have about product management is that when you're a new product manager or a leader as a product manager, your job is to learn, not to do. And so in this particular case, it's more about trying to understand the organization rather than trying to change it in some massive way right now. So that's the other thing to say. So I'm trying not to make excuses, but I totally agree with you. I totally.
It was an unfair question, but just
no, it's a fair question, absolutely. And the reason why it's a fair question is that I definitely want us to get to that point, and I'm doing things to get us to that point. But it's not something that you can change overnight with any organization. So what I'd say is like pick a piece of this and try it as an experiment within your organization and see if it works for you, and keep trying to do that type of thing, right? Like that's what I would say.
No, great. Yeah, I love the idea of it. I mean, definitely. I'm going to try some of these things, but yeah, cool. My backlog is way too big at the moment.
I would love to hear how it works out and if I can help with that. So
that's good.
Thanks.
Awesome. Give me one moment here. Awesome. So thanks, Chris, for the talk on alignment of strategy, roadmap, and backlog. As always, the presentation will be posted to our SlideShare channel. Big thank you from me, Nisrom, today's moderator, and to everyone who joined us today as part of the Product Mentor. Don't forget, if you're interested in joining the Product Mentor as a mentor, like Chris, you can join theproductmentor.com. If you'd like to post a job or are looking for a job as a product person, visit theproductjobs.com. Thank you, everyone, for joining, and enjoy your day.